The Blackwood Gang made their deadliest mistake at Cedar Ridge's market, mocking the old rancher, examining tomatoes. Thomas Hawkins straightened slowly, dust settling on his coat. They were laughing at the most lethal sharpshooter of the Civil War, a man who once killed 8 rebels with 8 shots in 7 seconds. They called him Ghost Eye then. He could take a man's life at 400 yards by moonlight. But that was before he traded his rifle for a plow, seeking peace in the Dakota Territory. Now, as 5 armed men surround him at the market stall, that peace is about to shatter. The West is about to remember why Confederate soldiers used to pray at the mere whisper of his name. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn painted the Dakota sky in shades of amber as Thomas Hawkins walked his fence line, checking for breaks with the same methodical precision he once used to scan battlefields. His ranch wasn't the biggest in Cedar Ridge, but every acre was maintained with military discipline. Even now, 15 years after Appomattox, old habits died hard. The morning dew had barely settled when Sarah Mitchell, the shopkeeper's daughter, came riding up his trail. Her face was flushed with urgency. "Mr. Hawkins, Pa sent me. The Blackwood Gang's back at the market. They're threatening to burn down Miller's store if he doesn't pay protection money." Thomas continued mending the fence, his weathered hands working the wire steadily. To anyone watching, he appeared unmoved by the news. But his mind was already calculating distances, angles, lines of sight, assessing the battlefield that Cedar Ridge's market would become. "Best head home, Miss Sarah," he said quietly. "Market's no place for a young lady today." "But Mr. Hawkins, you have to do something. Everyone knows you were a soldier." "Farmer now," he interrupted, driving another fence post into the stubborn earth. "Nothing more," Sarah's voice dropped. "Pa says you were more than just a soldier, says you were the best shot in the whole Union Army, says you once, your pa talks too much." Thomas straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. The motion was casual, but his eyes swept the horizon with sniper's precision. "Tell him I'll bring my wagon in later. Need to sell those tomatoes before they spoil." After Sarah rode off, Thomas stood motionless for a long moment. In his barn, wrapped in oiled cloth and hidden beneath floorboards, lay a Whitworth rifle, the same weapon that had made him a legend during the war. He hadn't touched it in years, had sworn he never would again. Too many nights haunted by the faces of men he killed at distances they couldn't even see him from. But as he walked back to his house, his steps were measured in yards. 400. To the barn, 350 to the water trough, 220 to the front door. Some habits couldn't be broken, no matter how hard a man tried to bury them. Inside, he moved to the mantel, where a small daguerreotype stood, the only personal item displayed in his sparse home. It showed a younger version of himself in Union blue, standing beside his spotter and best friend, James Mitchell. Sarah's father had survived the war, but lost an arm at Gettysburg. Now he ran the general store, keeping Thomas's secret while respecting his desire for peace. But peace, Thomas knew, sometimes came at a higher price than war. The Blackwood Gang had been pushing into Cedar Ridge for months, squeezing merchants, threatening farmers. He'd stayed out of it, telling himself it wasn't his fight anymore. As he washed up for the trip to town, Thomas caught his reflection in the basin. Grey streaked his temples, and years of ranch work had weathered his face, but his eyes were unchanged, steel blue and sharp as a hawk's. They were the eyes that had earned him his nickname Ghost Eye, though few living souls remembered that name now. He dressed with care, choosing clothes that would allow free movement while appearing harmless. Loose jacket to hide his still-muscled frame, worn boots that wouldn't impede quick footwork, every choice deliberate, just as he'd once selected firing positions and escape routes. The wagon was loaded with produce, but beneath the tomatoes lay something else. The oiled cloth package, From the barn, Thomas told himself he was just being cautious, that he wouldn't need it. But as he clucked to his horses and headed toward town, his mind was already mapping the market square, calculating fields of fire, identifying cover, planning for contingencies. Some men were born for peace, others had violence thrust upon them. But a rare few were born with a gift that made them deadly, and no amount of peaceful years could erase what was written in their bones. As Thomas's wagon rolled towards Cedar Ridge, the rhythmic creaking of wheels faded into the sounds of another time. The thunder of artillery, the screams of men dying in the fog at Antietam. Memories he'd tried to bury beneath 15 years of honest ranch work surfaced like corpses after rain. September 1862. The morning mist clung to the cornfield as Thomas lay prone in the mud, the Whitworth's barrel cool against his cheek. James Mitchell beside him, spotting through a brass telescope. 800 yards, James whispered. Confederate artillery crew. They're ranging our position. Thomas's finger curled around the trigger, eyes fixed on the distant gunners. He didn't need to think about windage or elevation anymore. The calculations came as naturally as breathing. The rifle cracked once. Through James's telescope, they watched the Confederate captain drop, a neat hole through his chest. "Jesus, Tom," James had whispered. "I couldn't even see his face at this distance." "Better that way," Thomas had replied, already adjusting his aim for the next shot. 5 more times the Whitworth spoke. 5 more men fell. The battery never fired a shot. Later, they'd found his shooting log in captured Confederate documents. Ghost eye sees all, distance no sanctuary. The rebels had started counting their dead in yards, 800 yards, 1,000 yards, 1,200 yards, distances where men should have been safe. The wagon hit a rut, jolting Thomas back to the present. His hands had been gripping. The reins too tight, knuckles white. The package beneath the tomato seemed to burn like a brand. He hadn't wanted to bring the rifle, but something in Sarah's eyes this morning had sparked a memory. The same fear he'd seen in civilian faces. During the war, another memory surfaced. Gettysburg, July 1863, the day James lost his arm. They'd been separated from their unit, pinned down by rebel skirmishers. James took a bullet, trying to reach better position. Thomas had watched his friend fall, blood staining Union blue to purple. What followed was never recorded in any official report. Thomas had gone cold inside, calculating angles and trajectories with mechanical precision. Over the next 3 hours, he'd eliminated 27 Confederate soldiers, each shot placed with surgical accuracy. When their own lines finally advanced, they found James, wounded but alive, and Thomas still shooting with emotionless efficiency. Like watching death himself take inventory, one sergeant had written. No wasted shots, no wasted motion, just the rifle's crack and another rebel falling. The commendations had come later, medals, promotions, offers to train other sharpshooters. Thomas had accepted none of it. After carrying James to safety, he'd vomited behind a stone wall, sick with the knowledge of what he was capable of. Cedar Ridge's church steeple appeared on the horizon, its white paint bright against the morning sky. Thomas found himself automatically noting its height, calculating firing angles. Perfect sniper's nest, if it came to that. But it wouldn't, couldn't. He touched the silver cross hanging beneath his shirt, his mother's final gift before fever took her. "God gave you a gift, Thomas," she'd said, "but remember, a gift can also be a curse if not used with wisdom." At the time, she'd meant his uncanny ability with a rifle, how he could outshoot grown men while still a boy. She couldn't have known how her words would haunt him through 4 years of war, through hundreds of kills at distances that seemed impossible. The wagon crested the final hill before town. Thomas could see activity in the market square. Horses he didn't recognize, men standing in clusters that spoke of trouble. His fingers brushed the wrapped rifle beneath the produce. One more memory surfaced. James's words the last time they'd spoken of the war. "You were the best because you never wanted to be, Tom. A man who loves killing ain't worth the powder to blow him to hell, but a man who hates it, who only does it when there's no other choice, that's the man I'd trust to watch my back. Thomas straightened on the wagon seat, shoulders squared. The weight of the hidden rifle felt almost comfortable now, like greeting an old friend you'd hoped never to see again. Cedar Ridge had grown since Thomas first settled here after the war. What started as a handful of buildings around a dusty crossroads had become a proper town, with a church, school, and enough commerce to attract both honest folk and predators. Like the Blackwood Gang, Sheriff Mills watched Thomas's wagon approach from his office porch, his weathered face grim. The tin star on his chest caught the morning sun, a symbol of law that meant less with each passing day. He was a good man, but age had stiffened his gun hand, and everyone knew it. "Brought those tomatoes awful early, Tom," Mills called out. As Thomas pulled his wagon to a stop, both men knew the vegetables weren't why he'd come. "Heard there might be some trouble at the market," Thomas replied quietly. "Thought I'd see for myself." Mills stepped closer, voice dropping. 5 of them showed up at dawn. Blackwood himself this time, not just his boys. They're collecting protection money from every stall. He paused, studying Thomas's face. "Killed a man in Fort Pierre last week, shot him in the back over $3. Thomas began unloading his wagon, movements deliberate. "That's so. I sent a wire to the marshal's office. Won't hear back for days." Mills touched his gun unconsciously. "I ain't as young as I used to be, Tom. Can't face down 5 killers alone." "Not asking you to, Sheriff." Thomas's hands never stopped working, but his eyes swept the street with tactical precision. 3 armed men lounging outside the saloon, 2 more by the livery, all watching the market square where Jacob Miller's store stood. Inside the general store, James Mitchell was arranging merchandise with his good arm when Thomas entered. The bell's cheerful jingle seemed out of place amid the morning's tension. "Came to see about that plow blade you ordered," Thomas said, loud enough for anyone listening. Then, quieter, "Sarah found me." James nodded, leading them behind a stack of flour barrels. "Blackwood's demanding $50 from every merchant monthly. Says those who don't pay might have accidents." His empty sleeve twitched, a tell from his war days. Miller tried standing up to them. They broke his fingers one by one. Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest, the same chill he'd known at Antietam at Gettysburg. "How many in town total?" 12 that I've counted. All hard cases." James hesitated. "Tom, these aren't common thugs. Blackwood was Confederate cavalry during the war. Mosby's raiders. Man knows tactics." A ghost of a smile touched Thomas's lips. "Mosby's boys never did learn to look up." At James's. "In questioning, look," he added, "best shooting positions are always high ground. They're watching the streets, not the roofs." Christ. James paled slightly. "You're actually considering it. After all these years, just studying the terrain." But Thomas's eyes had taken on that distant focus James remembered from the war. "Those extra windows you wanted in the store roof, might be time for that renovation." They emerged from behind the barrels to find Sarah arranging penny candy. Her hands trembled slightly. "Mr. Miller's boy is crying in the back," she whispered. "They hurt his pa right in front of him." Thomas felt the weight of the hidden rifle pressing against his leg. Through the wagon boards outside, 15 years of peace, 15 years of trying to forget what he was capable of, all crumbling because men like Blackwood thought they could prey on decent folk. "Sarah," he said softly, "might be best if you and your pa took that trip to visit your aunt soon." James caught his meaning immediately. "Tom, just a suggestion between friends." Thomas turned to go, then paused. "You still have that old brass telescope?" "In the back. Haven't used it since." James gestured at his empty sleeve. "Might want to dust it off, for old time's sake." As Thomas stepped back into the street, he heard the bell jingle again. Sheriff Mills had entered, his face drawn. "Just got word," the lawman said quietly. Blackwood's called in more men. 20 riders spotted heading this way from Fort Pierre. Thomas nodded, as if this was just weather news, but his mind was already calculating angles, distances, firing positions, the church steeple, the hotel roof, the grain storage behind Miller's store, high ground, clear lines of sight, ghost eyes, hunting grounds. The market square had gone quiet when Thomas returned, the kind of silence that hangs in the air before a storm breaks. Marcus Blackwood and his men had stationed themselves in front of Miller's store, making a show of examining merchandise while their gun hands never strayed far from their holsters. Blackwood cut an impressive figure, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a Confederate cavalry officer's coat that had seen better days. His eyes tracked Thomas as he began unloading tomatoes, measuring the older man with the calculated interest of a predator. "Fine-looking produce," Blackwood called out, his Virginia accent thick as honey. "Shame if anything were to happen to it." He strolled over, spurs jingling with each step. "Way I hear it, accidents are common in these parts. Fire, theft, violence." He picked up a tomato, squeezed until it burst. "But we can prevent such unfortunate occurrences. For a reasonable fee." Thomas continued unloading his wagon, his movements unhurried. "Nothing reasonable about extortion, Captain Blackwood." The gang leader stiffened slightly. "You know who I am? Mosby's Raiders, 3rd Squadron, caused us considerable trouble in '64. Thomas set down another crate. "Though, as I recall, you preferred attacking supply wagons to facing real soldiers." Color rose in Blackwood's face. Behind him, his men spread out in a practiced formation that spoke of military training. The market cleared quickly, townspeople vanishing into doorways and behind wagons. "Careful, old man." Blackwood's hand drifted to his gun. "War's long over. This is business." "Business." Thomas straightened slowly. "Like breaking Jacob Miller's fingers was business? Man needed to learn respect." Blackwood's smile turned ugly. "Like you do." The gang leader's draw was fast, but Thomas was already moving. His left hand swept up, catching Blackwood's wrist as the revolver cleared leather. His right hand struck, like a snake, fingers finding pressure points that made the younger man's grip spasm open. The gun clattered to the dirt. 4 more revolvers appeared instantly, held by men who knew their trade. Thomas stood very still, Blackwood's wrist still, caught in an iron grip. "Kill him!" Blackwood snarled, trying to break free. "I wouldn't," Thomas said quietly. His voice had changed, taken on the cold precision of a man calculating trajectories. "Your men are bunched too close. First shot will startle their horses. Second shot goes wide. By the time they adjust, I'll have broken your arm in 3 places and be behind Miller's wagon, which leaves them firing into the sun, missing, probably hitting civilians." He smiled thinly. "Poor tactical positioning, Captain. Mosby taught you better than that." Something in his voice, the casual certainty, the professional assessment, made Blackwood's men hesitate. Their leader saw it too, fury warring with growing uncertainty. "Who are you?" "Just a farmer." Thomas released his grip, stepped back. "One who'd prefer peace, but if you force war..." His eyes swept the armed men with sniper's precision. "Well, I've had more practice at that than you know." Blackwood massaged his wrist, glaring. 20 more men riding in by sundown. This isn't over." "No," Thomas agreed, "but it will be." He turned his back deliberately, returned to unloading tomatoes. Behind him, he heard muttered curses, the shuffle of boots, horses being mounted. As the gang rode out, Sheriff Mills emerged from his office. "They'll be back." "Yes." Thomas looked up at the church steeple, then the hotel roof, then the grain storage. High ground, clear lines of sight, long shadows in the setting sun. Might want to keep people off the streets around sunset. And make... "Sure, Sarah Mitchell's got that telescope ready." "Tom," Mills said quietly, "how many can you—" "All of them." Thomas's voice was soft, emotionless. "From up there, with good light and a steady wind, I could kill every man they send. Clean, quick, at distances they won't believe possible. He looked at his hands, calloused from farming, but still marked with powder burns from another life. Question is, do I want to become that man again? The sheriff touched his tin star. Sometimes a man doesn't get to choose. Sometimes the fight chooses him. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Thomas walked to his wagon. Beneath the remaining tomatoes wrapped in oiled cloth, the Whitworth rifle waited, Ghost Eye's tool, still deadly after all these years. Choice or not by sunset, Cedar Ridge would remember why Confederate soldiers once spoke his name in whispers. News travels fast in a frontier town. By midday, 3 different versions of the market confrontation had spread through Cedar Ridge. Some said Thomas had disarmed Blackwood with lightning speed. Others claimed he'd predicted every move the gang would make before they made it. A few whispered about his connection to the war, though none knew the full truth yet. In the general store, James Mitchell found himself surrounded by curious townspeople. They'd finally noticed his war connection to Thomas, and the questions came relentlessly. Is it true he was a sharpshooter? Young Tommy Miller asked, his father's broken fingers wrapped in fresh bandages. James measured coffee beans carefully. Buying time. Some stories are better left in the past, he said finally. But his hand strayed to the brass telescope he'd placed on the counter, a gesture not lost on the observant. Outside, 2 of Blackwood's men rode past slowly, watching. They'd been circling town all morning, like wolves testing a flock's defenses. Their presence kept people indoors, speaking in whispers. Thomas spent the afternoon on his ranch, but not tending crops. In his barn, he'd opened a trunk untouched for 15 years. Inside lay the tools of his former trade. The spotting scope, the leather-bound range books filled with calculations, and most importantly, cleaning supplies for the Whitworth. The rifle lay disassembled on his workbench, each piece being methodically cleaned and checked. Some men might have found the weapon rusty after so many years. But Thomas had maintained it every month in secret, unable to fully abandon the habits that had kept him alive through 4 years of war. A horse's approach brought his head up. Through the barn door, he saw Sheriff Mills riding in, looking troubled, found. These nailed to trees along the Fort Pierre Road, Mills said, handing over a stack of papers. Wanted posters, freshly printed. They showed a sketch of Thomas from his war days, offering $500 for information about the Union Ghost, his other nickname, the one the Confederate Army had used in official reports. Blackwood's been busy, Thomas observed, continuing to clean his rifle. He's got a telegram operator in his pocket at Fort Pierre, Mills confirmed. Been wiring every Confederate veteran in 3 territories. Claims he's found the man who killed their brothers from 1,000 yards. Thomas's hands never stopped their practiced motion with the cleaning rod. And have they responded? 6. Riders came in an hour ago, more on the way, all wearing grey uniforms. Mills shifted uncomfortably. These aren't just hired guns, Tom. They're true believers, men who lost friends to your rifle. They're calling it a holy crusade. Nothing holy about revenge. Thomas began reassembling the Whitworth, each piece clicking into place with precision. Though it does simplify matters, professionals can be reasoned with. Fanatics have to be stopped. Town's scared, Mills admitted. Not just of them. Of you, too. The stories are growing. Some say you killed hundreds during the war. That you could shoot a man's eyes out at a mile. Thomas's hands stilled on the rifle. 812 confirmed kills. Average range 700 yards. Longest confirmed shot was 1,812 yards. Caught a Confederate colonel ordering a charge at Gettysburg. The bullet took 3.5 seconds. To reach him, his voice was clinical, detached. I kept count because each one mattered. Each one took a piece of my soul. Mills absorbed this in silence. Finally, he asked, "How many can you handle?" "All of them." Thomas lifted the reassembled rifle, checking the sight alignment. But it won't end with just killing. Men like Blackwood, they'll keep coming, keep seeking revenge. I'll have to make it more than a fight." He looked at Mills, his eyes hard. "I'll have to make it a legend. Something so terrible, they'll speak of it in whispers 50 years from now." A cold wind whipped through the barn, carrying the first hints of evening. In town, James Mitchell was quietly moving his telescope to the church tower. In the hotel, Tommy Miller helped his father load spare rifles despite his broken fingers. And in saloons across 3 territories, men in grey uniforms were mounting up, drawn by the chance to kill the legendary Ghost Eye. But they were riding toward something worse than a legend. They were riding toward a mathematical certainty. A man who understood trajectory and distance the way other men understood breathing. A man who had once turned warfare into an equation, death into a calculation. "Pray for them, Sheriff," Thomas said softly, sliding the cleaning rod back into its case. "Because up there, in the dying light with a good wind, I become something else, something even I fear." The sun was starting its slow descent. Soon, the streets of Cedar Ridge would become a geometry problem, each angle and shadow a variable in Ghost Eye's deadly mathematics. Dusk painted Cedar Ridge in shades of purple and gold, a sniper's favorite light. Thomas stood in the church tower, the Whitworth's barrel resting on a hymnal he'd placed on the windowsill. Beside him, James Mitchell adjusted his telescope, the brass catching the dying sun. 12 riders approaching from the south, James reported, his voice falling naturally into the cadence they'd used during the war. Leading group of 4, then pairs spread out, range 800 yards. Wind? Light. Breeze from the west, quarter value. Thomas's fingers made minute adjustments to the sight. "They're riding into the sun. Tactical mistake. Like old times," James murmured. Then, "Wait, I know that man in front. Colonel Harrison Wade, commanded the 7th Virginia at Gettysburg." "I remember." Thomas's voice was soft. "He lost his brother to my rifle that day, 840 yards, the shot that earned me the name Ghost Eye." Below, Cedar Ridge's streets had emptied. Sheriff Mills had spread the word. Everyone inside. Doors locked, shutters drawn. Only Tommy Miller remained visible, sitting apparently alone on his father's store porch, looking vulnerable. The bait in their trap. The riders approached slowly, Wade in the lead. His Confederate colonel's uniform was freshly pressed, brass buttons, gleaming. When they reached the market square, he raised a hand, halting his men. "Ghost Eye," his voice carried clearly in the evening air. "We know you're up there. Come down and face us like a man." Thomas's finger rested lightly on the trigger. "Range?" 712 yards to Wade, others spreading out. "They know I'm in the tower, trying to stay dispersed." Thomas allowed himself a small smile. "But they're forgetting about the angles. Line of sight to the hotel roof." James swung his telescope. "Clear. Sheriff's in position with the Spencer rifle." Wade was still shouting challenges, but Thomas tuned him out, focusing on the mathematics of death. Each rider's position became a coordinate, each gust of wind a variable in his equation. "Ammo check," he whispered. 15 rounds, hand-loaded. James's voice held grim satisfaction. "Just like you showed me last night. Extra powder for the range." The sun touched the horizon. Wade drew his revolver, aiming at Tommy Miller. "Last chance, Ghost Eye. Show yourself or the boy dies." Thomas exhaled slowly, settling into that cold, precise place where emotion couldn't reach. "Call it. Target 1, Wade, 712 yards. Wind steady." The Whitworth's crack shattered the evening peace. Before the sound reached the square, Wade's revolver was spinning in the dirt, along with 2 fingers of his right hand. Chaos erupted. Riders wheeled their horses, guns appearing, but Thomas was already adjusting his aim. The rifle's barrel moving with mathematical precision. Target 2, right flank, 695 yards. Crack! A rider's hat flew off, along with a slice of scalp. Non-fatal but terrifying. Target 3, near the water trough. 700 even. Crack. A horse reared as its reins were severed, dumping its rider in the dust. "They're breaking formation," James reported with professional satisfaction. "Bunching. Up by Miller's store. 6 targets close together." "Mills." Thomas spoke into the speaking tube they'd rigged to the hotel roof. "Drive them west." The Spencer rifle opened up from above, forcing the riders to seek cover exactly where Thomas wanted them. The mathematics were perfect. Each man, trying to hide, was actually moving into a pre-calculated firing position. "Range 650, James called. 4 targets clear." The Whitworth spoke 4 times in rapid succession. 4 guns went flying, each with at least one finger still gripping the trigger. No killing shots, but the message was clear. Every man within range was alive, only because Ghost Eye chose not to take their lives. "Wade's making a run for it," James reported. 800 yards and counting." Thomas lifted his head from the rifle. "Let him go. He'll spread the word." Below, Tommy Miller was helping Sheriff Mills disarm the wounded men. None had been killed, but each had been marked. A lost finger, a scalped head, a shattered gun hand. Each would carry permanent proof of what happened when you challenged Ghost Eye. "Just like Antietam," James said quietly. "You could have killed them all." Deaths create martyrs. Thomas began cleaning the Whitworth methodically. Survivors create legends. By tomorrow, every man who rides for Blackwood will have heard how I can shoot the buttons off their uniforms at half a mile. Speaking of Blackwood, James swung his telescope south. Large group approaching, 20, maybe 30 riders, moving slow, tactical formation. That'll be him with the main force. Thomas nodded unsurprised. "Good, that means he got my message." "Message?" "Left a note in Wade's saddlebag before he rode off, explaining the mathematics of what happens next. Every angle, every line of sight, every fatal trajectory around Cedar Ridge." He smiled thinly. "Told him I've spent 15 years calculating exactly how to turn this town into a killing ground." James lowered his telescope. "You're trying to get in his head, make him fear the geometry. Men like Blackwood understand violence. But this?" Thomas gestured at the precise pattern of wounded. "Men below, this is something else. This is science, math, the certainty of a bullet's path calculated to the inch." He chambered a fresh round. "By morning, they'll be calling this the mathematics of murder." The sun had set, but in the gathering dark, Ghost Eye's legend was just beginning to rise. Night settled over Cedar Ridge like a burial shroud. Thomas sat alone in the church tower, cleaning the Whitworth by touch, each motion ingrained by thousands of repetitions. Below, the wounded men had been moved to the doctor's office. There, moans, carrying on the night wind. The mathematics of violence played through his mind, trajectories, windage, gravity's pull on a spinning bullet. But other calculations haunted him too. 812 confirmed kills, each one catalogued. In the leather notebook he'd kept during the war. Names, ranges, dates. Some men counted money. Ghost Eye had counted souls. "Brought you some coffee." James's voice came from the stairwell. "And company." Sheriff Mills followed him up, along with young Tommy Miller. The boy's eyes were wide, taking in the sniper's nest Thomas had created. Range cards tacked to the walls, wind indicators made from torn strips of cloth, precise measurements marked in chalk. "The riders you warned about," Mills reported. "They've made camp just beyond rifle range. Blackwood's got them digging in, setting up proper fortifications." Thomas nodded, unsurprised. He was Confederate cavalry, knows about siege work. "Tell me something." Mills settled against the wall, studying Thomas. "Those men today, you could have killed them clean. Why take fingers instead?" "Because death has a mathematics all its own." Thomas's hands never stopped working on the rifle. "Kill. A man his friends seek revenge, but mark him. Let him live to tell about precision he can't comprehend. That breeds fear. Fear spreads like multiplication." Tommy stepped forward, something clutched in his hands. "Mr. Hawkins, Pa wanted you to have this." He held out a battered tin star, a deputy's badge. Said maybe it's time the law had a long arm to match its reach. Thomas stared at the badge, memories surfacing like corpses in a flood. Another badge, another time. The silver shield of a Union Army sharpshooter pressed into his hand after that bloody day at Antietam. He'd thrown it in a river after the war. Your father's a wise man, Tommy, but a badge means rules, procedures. He gestured at the rifle. What I do, it's not law enforcement. It's applied geometry, the mathematics of ending men. Tell him, James said quietly. Tell him about Harrison. Thomas's hands stilled on the Whitworth. Colonel Wade's brother, Richard Harrison Wade. He was leading a charge at Gettysburg, 840 yards out. I calculated the shot for 12 minutes. Wind speed, humidity, Earth's rotation. Then I did something no one thought possible. What did you do? Tommy whispered. I shot through a gap in the trees that was exactly 8 inches wide. The bullet traveled in an arc, 26 feet high at its peak. It took 4 seconds to reach him. Thomas's voice was distant, reciting numbers that had burned themselves into his soul. The bullet hit him precisely where his collarbones met. He never heard the shot that killed him. That's when they started calling you Ghost Eye, James added. The impossible shot. The one that proved you weren't just accurate. You were something else entirely. I was a mathematician. Thomas picked up the badge, let it catch the moonlight. I turned death into an equation. And that's what Blackwood fears most. Not my aim, not my nerve. He fears the cold certainty of numbers. Because you can fight a man, but you can't fight mathematics. Tommy looked at the simple chalk calculations on the walls with new understanding. Is that why you marked all these measurements, every distance, every angle? Cedar Ridge is a problem to be solved. Thomas stood, moving to the window. Every street, every roof, every shadow, they're all variables in my equation. And tomorrow, when Blackwood makes his move, I'll solve for X, where X equals the precise moment each man realizes he's nothing but a coordinate in Ghost Eye's geometry. In the distance, campfires marked Blackwood's position. Thomas could almost feel them out there, those men in grey, telling stories about the Union devil who killed with mathematical precision. By morning, their fear would have multiplied, spread, grown like compound interest. I'll take the badge, he said finally. But understand this, I won't be enforcing the law. I'll be enforcing the laws of physics, gravity, motion, the immutable. Mathematics that turns a bullet's path into destiny. He pinned the star to his vest, right over his heart. In the moonlight it gleamed like a sniper's scope. Dawn brought changes to Cedar Ridge. While Thomas maintained his vigil in the church tower, the town below transformed with quiet precision. Shopkeepers boarded windows at exact angles, following his calculations for optimal defense. Women filled canteens and prepared bandages with military efficiency. Every movement had purpose, like components in a complex equation. James Mitchell had turned his general store into a command center. His brass telescope now anchored a network of observers, townspeople positioned at key points, each armed with small mirrors for signaling. They'd practiced through the night until their timing was perfect. Mirror flash from the South Ridge, James reported. Blackwood's men are moving supplies forward, setting up firing positions, Thomas made a note in his range book. And our preparations? Miller's getting the children into the root cellars. Sheriff's deputized 12 men, all veterans. And Sarah's got every woman in town measuring powder charges exactly like you showed them. The precision of their response would have surprised Blackwood. He expected chaos, panic. Instead, he faced a town operating like a well-oiled machine, each person a calculated variable in Ghost Eye's defensive geometry. Tommy Miller appeared with a stack of papers, hand-drawn maps of Cedar Ridge, each marked with range calculations and wind indicators. He'd spent the night copying them, his young hand carefully reproducing Thomas's precise measurements. Distributed these to all the defensive positions, Tommy reported. Every man knows exactly what you can see from the tower, down to the inch. Thomas nodded approval. The boy had inherited his father's attention to detail. And the special project, Tommy's eyes lit up. Finished an hour ago. Want to see? They descended the tower stairs to where the church pews had been pushed back. There, drawn on the wooden floor in careful chalk lines, was a perfect scale model of Cedar Ridge. Every building, every alley, every possible firing position mapped with mathematical precision. Used your measurements, Tommy explained proudly. 1 inch equals 10 yards. Even marked the wind patterns you recorded. Thomas studied the model, seeing not just a map, but a battlefield equation waiting to be solved. Excellent work. This will help coordinate our defense. He pointed to key intersections. These are the critical variables, where their movements will be most predictable. More townspeople arrived, drawn by word of the map. Sheriff Mills knelt to study it, his deputy's star glinting alongside Thomas's. Like a chessboard, he mused. Chess is just applied mathematics, Thomas replied. Move and countermove, probability and position. He traced a line from the church tower. From here, I can control these 8 key points. Anyone moving through them becomes part of my equation. James Mitchell wheeled over a crate he'd brought, pulled from his store. Inside lay boxes of custom ammunition, each round hand-loaded to Thomas's exact specifications. 50 rounds, he reported, each one measured down to the grain. Thomas lifted a bullet, feeling its perfect weight. During the war, he'd learned that accuracy wasn't just about aim, it was about consistency. Every variable had to be precise, from powder charge to bullet weight, riders approaching. The call came from above, where Sarah Mitchell had taken over telescope duty. Single file under white flag. Thomas returned to the tower, the Whitworth. Ready but not aimed. Through the morning haze, he saw 3 men approaching, Blackwood in the lead, carrying a white handkerchief. Range 600 yards, Sarah reported crisply. She'd learned the spotter's role quickly, just as she'd mastered the ammunition measurements. Let them come, Thomas said quietly. Time to teach them about advanced mathematics. Below, the townspeople moved to their assigned positions, each one a known quantity in his defensive formula. They weren't just farmers and shopkeepers anymore. They were variables in Ghost Eye's equation, turning Cedar Ridge into a calculated killing ground. Blackwood was about to learn that the deadliest weapon in war isn't the gun, it's the mind, that turns violence into mathematics, death into geometry, and a small frontier town into an unsolvable problem. In Blackwood's camp, men gathered around fires, sharing whispered stories about Ghost Eye. Each tale grew with the telling, spreading fear like a mathematical formula. One man's lost fingers multiplied into dozens of impossible shots, each more terrifying than the last. Heard he can read the wind by watching dust motes, a young rider muttered. Calculates range by counting his own heartbeats. That ain't the half of it, Colonel Wade growled, holding up his maimed hand. He didn't. Just shoot my fingers off. He shot through the exact center of my trigger guard. A pole no bigger than a dime, at 700 yards. Under the white flag, Blackwood approached the town square, his face carved from stone. Thomas watched through his scope, reading the subtle signs of fear in the gang leader's posture. That the mathematics of terror were working. He's got 2 men hidden in the rocks, Sarah reported from her spotting position. About 800 yards back. Counter-snipers, Thomas nodded. Ex-military by their positioning. Good, but not good enough. They've forgotten about the morning sun angle. Blackwood reined his horse to a stop in the prescribed spot, marked by a small chalk X that only Thomas could see from the tower. Everything in Cedar Ridge had become part of his calculations, even the ground men stood upon. Ghost Eye! Blackwood's voice carried clearly. "I've come to negotiate." Thomas's response was precisely calibrated. The Whitworth cracked once, sending a bullet through Blackwood's hat brim, cutting a groove so fine it looked like tailoring. "Negotiations require trust," Thomas called back. "Your hidden men have 30 seconds to show themselves. I've already calculated their range." The shock on Blackwood's face was visible even without the scope. He waved frantically at the distant rocks, and 2 riders emerged, weapons held high. "Better," Thomas said. "Now let's discuss mathematics." "Mathematics?" Blackwood spat. "I came to talk terms." "Everything is mathematics, Captain. The precise angle of your hat, the exact distance to your men, the chemistry of the powder in their rifles." Thomas's voice carried the cold certainty of numbers. "Would you like me to demonstrate the geometry of death?" To punctuate his point, the Whitworth spoke twice more. 2 rifles flew from the distant. Men's hands, each with a perfect hole drilled through its barrel. "Impossible," Blackwood whispered, but loud enough for Thomas's keen ears. "No one can shoot like that." "Not impossible, mathematical. Would you like to see my calculations?" Thomas's tone was almost professorial. "I spent 15 years measuring every angle, every distance, every variable in Cedar Ridge. This town isn't just my home, it's my theorem. And you're about to become part of my proof." In the church below, Tommy Miller added 2 more marks to the scale model, the precise spots where the rifles had been shot. Each point in Ghost Eye's equation was mapped, measured, and marked. "You have 1 hour," Thomas continued. "Take your men and ride out. After that, I start solving for X, where X equals the exact moment each man dies, calculated to the second." Blackwood's face flushed with rage. "You think numbers can stop 30 armed men? Numbers are all that exist, Captain. Your men's lives are just variables in my equation. Would you like to know the exact order they'll fall? I've already calculated it based on their positions and probable movements. To demonstrate, the Whitworth cracked one final time. A playing card that had been stuck in one of the distant rider's hatbands fluttered to the ground, split perfectly in half lengthwise. "That shot," Thomas said quietly, "had 14 variables. Wind speed, humidity, barrel temperature, Earth's rotation, atmospheric pressure." He let the litany of calculations hang in the air. "Imagine what I can do when I'm actually trying to kill." Blackwood wheeled his horse, dignity warring with fear. As he rode back to his men, Thomas could already see the equation playing out. How the story would spread, how fear would multiply through their ranks like compound interest. "They're not leaving," Sarah observed. "No," Thomas agreed. "Pride won't let them, but fear will make them sloppy. And in mathematics, sloppy means dead." The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist and revealing Cedar Ridge in its full, geometric glory, a battlefield measured and marked by a man who had turned death into an equation. Sarah Mitchell's urgent footsteps on the tower stairs broke Thomas's concentration. Her face was pale, hands trembling as she held out a telegram. "Found this in Pa's store," she whispered. "Hidden under the counter. It's from 3 days ago." Thomas read the yellow paper, his expression hardening with each line. The message was in code, but he recognized it, the same cipher the Confederate Army had used during the war. And James Mitchell knew it too. "Your father's been feeding them information," he said quietly. "Every measurement, every calculation, I shared with him." "There's more," Sarah's voice cracked. "In his desk, letters going back months. He's been working with Blackwood from the start, helping them plan which towns to hit, when to strike. The mathematics of betrayal were brutally simple. 1 trusted friend plus 20 years of shared secrets equaled catastrophe." Thomas's mind raced, recalculating every variable. If James had betrayed them, then Blackwood knew far more than he'd shown. "Get Sheriff Mills," Thomas ordered. Quietly, But when Sarah reached the bottom of the stairs, gunfire erupted from the general store. Not random shots, precise coordinated volleys, targeting the church tower's support structures. The geometry was perfect, the timing exact. They'd learned more than just his measurements. They'd learned how he thought. "Multiple shooters," Sarah called out. "They're using Pa's range markers." Thomas's rifle snapped up, but the angles were all wrong. James had helped position every defensive post, had known exactly where Thomas would place his shots. The ambush was mathematically perfect. "Tommy!" Thomas shouted down to the church floor. "The model! Check the measurements!" The boy scrambled to the chalk diagram, measuring distances with shaking hands. "They're off," he called back. "Just slightly, but every critical distance is wrong by exactly 2%. Thomas allowed himself a grim smile. The mathematics of revenge had a poetry to it. James had altered the measurements just enough to throw off crucial shots, knowing Thomas would trust his numbers implicitly. "Sarah, mirror signals," he commanded. "Warning pattern." But the girl's face went even paler. "The mirrors are reflecting wrong, the angles." "Your father repositioned them last night," Thomas finished, "under the pretense of improving the network. He's turned our own geometry against us." A bullet sparked off the tower's bell, the angle calculating to split their forces. More shots followed, each perfectly placed to deny them clean lines of retreat. The mathematics were elegant in their betrayal. Through his scope, Thomas caught a glimpse of James Mitchell in the general store window, directing fire with military precision. The friend who'd once spotted for Ghost Eye was now plotting his destruction with the same mathematical accuracy. Why? Sarah's whisper held generations of hurt. "The war never ended for some," Thomas replied, his mind already calculating new variables, factoring in the betrayal. "Your father lost more than his arm at Gettysburg, lost his faith in the Union, in me." The shooting intensified, each bullet following paths Thomas himself had mapped. His own calculations turned back on him like a mirror reflecting death, but mirrors could be broken, and mathematics could be rewritten. "Tommy," he called down, "bring me your father's ledger, the one with the store's measurements." A plan was forming, built on new equations. Time to show them why Ghost Eye doesn't need numbers to kill. Under heavy fire, Thomas and Sarah retreated to the church's vestry, where Tommy waited with his father's store ledger. But it wasn't the measurements that caught Thomas's eye. It was a weathered envelope, fallen from between the pages. Inside, he found a photograph that stopped his breath. Two young men in cadet uniforms at West Point, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling at a future that war would soon shatter. "That's Pa," Sarah said, pointing to James. "But who's the other one?" "Marcus Blackwood," Thomas said quietly. "Before he chose the Confederacy, before I killed his son at Antietam." The mathematics of tragedy suddenly multiplied. This wasn't just about territory or revenge. It was about a debt of blood, 20 years in the making. "Young Marcus was a lot like you, Tommy," Thomas continued, his voice distant. 16, eager to prove himself, rode with his father's cavalry unit as a messenger. I didn't know who he was when I took the shot, just another rider at 800 yards, calculated the trajectory perfectly. His hands tightened on the photograph. Found out later he was carrying letters, not battle plans, including one to his uncle James Mitchell. Sarah's face went white. "Pa's nephew? Then Blackwood is your uncle. And this whole raid, it's not about Cedar Ridge at all. It's about family." More shots peppered the church walls, but Thomas barely heard them. His mind was racing through years of calculations, seeing the pattern. James Mitchell's betrayal, Blackwood's precision, the way they'd turned his own mathematics against him. They've been planning this for years, he realized. Every measurement, every angle I shared with James, he passed them to his brother-in-law. They knew I'd trust him implicitly because Of our war service, the perfect equation for revenge. Tommy studied the scale model of the town, his young mind adapting quickly. Then all these measurements, they're not just wrong by accident. No, they're wrong in exactly the way that would get me killed. Thomas's tactical mind was already recalculating. James knew my methods, knew I'd rely on the numbers. He and Blackwood created a trap based on pure mathematics. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of Blackwood directing his men. The gang. Leader's movements had a new context now. The precision of a West Point education combined with a father's need for vengeance. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her world shattered by revelations of blood and betrayal. Thomas picked up the Whitworth, feeling its familiar weight. "We change the equation. They expect Ghost Eye, the mathematical killer. Time to show them something they can't calculate. A man fighting for more than just numbers." A mirror flash from the general store caught his eye. James Mitchell using their own signals to coordinate the attack. The betrayal had a certain mathematical elegance to it, a geometry of vengeance decades in the making. "Tommy," Thomas said quietly, "your father's ledger, does it show the basement measurements?" "Yes, sir. Every beam, every support." "Good, because it's time to teach your Uncle Blackwood that some problems can't be solved with mathematics." He smiled grimly. "Sometimes you have to rewrite the whole equation." Thunder rolled across Cedar Ridge as storm clouds gathered, casting strange shadows through the church's stained glass. Thomas stood at the altar, the town's defenders gathered around him, the scale model of Cedar Ridge between them now marked. With the true measurements Tommy had extracted from the store ledger. "Forget everything you knew," Thomas instructed. "Every position, every angle we planned, it's all compromised, but that gives us an advantage they won't expect." "How's being betrayed an advantage?" Sheriff Mills demanded. "Because they think they know exactly what I'll do. James taught Blackwood my mathematics, my precision." Thomas's eyes held a dangerous glint. "So, we're going to show them what happens when Ghost Eye stops calculating and starts hunting." He moved wooden markers across the model showing new positions, not the clean mathematical placement of before, but something more primal, something unpredictable. "They're expecting geometry," he continued. "Instead, they'll get chaos, controlled chaos, but chaos nonetheless." Sarah Mitchell stepped forward, her face set with determination. "Pa will be watching the church tower. He knows that's your preferred position." "Exactly, which is why I won't be there." Thomas pointed to locations across the model. "We're going to move constantly. Random patterns, no fixed positions, like smoke in the wind." Lightning flashed outside as he detailed the new strategy. The defenders listened intently as Ghost Eye, the mathematical killer, taught them to embrace uncertainty. "Tommy, you've memorized your father's ledger?" At the boy's nod, Thomas continued. "Good, because we're going to use his own measurements against them. The basement supports, the load-bearing walls, every structural weakness he mapped out, thinking it would help them trap us." The boy's eyes lit with understanding. "We're going to collapse the store?" "Not just collapse it. We're going to turn Cedar Ridge itself into a weapon. Every building James measured, every angle he mapped, they're not just numbers anymore, they're pressure points." Thunder crashed closer as Thomas moved through the plan. The mathematics of destruction were being rewritten, transformed into something organic and unpredictable. The very precision that James and Blackwood had counted on would become their undoing. "They'll expect me to try for killing shots," Thomas explained. "Long-range precision." Instead, he demonstrated with the Whitworth, showing them how to target, building supports, how to create chain reactions of structural failure. "We're going to make the ground beneath their feet uncertain." Sarah studied the model, seeing her hometown through new eyes. "How many men does Blackwood have now?" 43, Thomas answered without hesitation, plus James directing their movements. "But numbers don't matter anymore. This isn't about counting casualties or calculating trajectories. This is about making them feel what it's like to face a ghost. Lightning illuminated the church interior as Thomas moved markers again, showing how they would appear and disappear, strike and fade, the mathematics of warfare giving way to the artistry of terror. "When the storm hits," he said quietly, "we begin. They're expecting the old ghost eye, the man who kills with mathematical precision. Instead, they'll face something new, something that can't be calculated or predicted." He looked at each defender in turn, seeing the understanding in their eyes. The time for precise measurements and careful calculations was over. Now they would become what the legend of Ghost Eye had always hinted at, something that moved like wind through the valley of death, striking without warning or pattern. "Remember," Thomas said as another thunderclap shook the church, "they know all my old tricks, all my mathematics, all my precise shots." He smiled, and there was nothing of calculation in it. "So let's show them something they can't measure. Let's show them what real ghosts can do." The storm was about to break over Cedar Ridge, and with it, a new kind of warfare would begin. Not the clean geometry of a sniper's mathematics, but the deadly dance of shadows in the rain. The storm held its breath over Cedar Ridge, dark clouds swirling, but not yet breaking. In the gathering darkness, Thomas made his final rounds, checking positions not with his usual mathematical precision, but with a predator's instinct. He found Sarah in the church bell tower, her father's brass telescope pointed toward the general store. Even now, she watched the place where James Mitchell coordinated with Blackwood's men, turning decades of trust into strategies for murder. "You don't have to stay," Thomas said quietly. "Yes, I do." Her voice was steel wrapped in silk. "Pa taught me to spot for you, just like he used to. Time to show him I learnt more than just numbers." In the street below, Tommy Miller worked with the other defenders, spreading oil-soaked sawdust in seemingly random patterns. But Thomas saw the artistry in it. Not the clean lines of mathematics, but the flowing shapes of a trap designed by instinct rather than calculation. "Got something for you," Sheriff Mills said, approaching with a wooden box. Inside lay an old Colt revolver, its brass fittings dull with age. "Army issued, carried it through the war. Figure tonight's the kind of night that calls for a backup. In plan." Thomas lifted the weapon, feeling its weight. During the war, he'd never carried a sidearm, trusting in the Whitworth's reach and his own calculations. But tonight wasn't about trust or mathematics. "Blackwood's men are moving," Sarah reported from above, "setting up in all the positions Pa measured." "Let them," Thomas replied, checking the Colt's action. "Those measurements belong to Ghost Eye, the mathematician. Tonight they face something else, something." Thunder growled closer as Thomas made his way to Miller's store, where Jacob Miller waited with his splintered fingers and burning eyes. "My numbers are true," Tommy reported, pointing to his father's ledger. "Every support beam, every load-bearing wall. When you need them to fall, they'll fall." Miller Sr. gripped Thomas's arm with his good hand. "Make him pay," he whispered. "Not just for my fingers, for betraying what Cedar Ridge stands for." The first fat drops of rain began to fall as Thomas completed his circuit of the town. Each defender he passed nodded grimly, understanding their role in what was to come. Not soldiers moving with precision, but hunters preparing to stalk through. Storm and shadow. At the church steps, he found young Billy Thompson, the blacksmith's son, clutching one of the signal mirrors. "What if I get the angles wrong?" the boy asked. "All Pa's measurements." "Forget the measurements," Thomas told him. "Watch the lightning. When it flashes, use your instincts. Tonight we're not calculating angles, we're painting with light and shadow." The wind picked up, carrying the promise of violence. Through his scope, Thomas caught glimpses of Blackwood's men taking their positions, each one exactly where James's measurements suggested would be safe from Ghost Eye's legendary accuracy. "They're all in place." Sarah's voice came through the Speaking tube. Pa's with them now, showing them your old firing lines. Thomas allowed himself a grim smile. Your father taught them to think like mathematicians. Time to show them how a ghost really hunts. The first lightning bolt split the sky, illuminating Cedar Ridge in stark relief. For just a moment, Thomas saw everything. The troops positioned with mathematical precision, the measured fields of fire, the carefully calculated kill zones, all based on numbers and trajectories that would mean nothing in the chaos to come. "Storm's almost here," Sheriff Mills observed. "No," Thomas replied, feeling the rain begin to fall in earnest. "The storm's already here, they just don't know it yet." He thought of James Mitchell, his old spotter, now using their shared knowledge to orchestrate his destruction. Of Blackwood, the West Point cadet turned vengeful father. Of all the precise calculations and careful measurements that had turned Cedar Ridge into a geometric trap. But geometry couldn't capture the way lightning turned raindrops into silver bullets. Mathematics couldn't predict the way thunder could mask a hunter's approach. And no equation could calculate what happened when Ghost Eye stopped measuring and simply became the legend they all feared. "Time to begin," Thomas said softly as the storm broke over Cedar Ridge. "Let's show them why ghosts don't need mathematics to haunt men's souls." Lightning split the sky as the first shot came from the general store. James Mitchell using his intimate knowledge of Thomas's preferred firing positions to target the church tower. But the tower stood empty, Ghost Eye already gone like smoke. In the wind, the Whitworth's answer came from nowhere and everywhere, its crack lost in thunder. Not a killing shot, but something worse, the support beam of Miller's awning exploding, sending Blackwood's men scrambling as the structure groaned. "That's not possible," James shouted over the storm. "I calculated every angle. He can't shoot from there." But Thomas wasn't calculating anymore. The mathematical precision of Ghost Eye had given way to something more primal. Each shot sparked new chaos, a window frame here, a roof support there. The very measurements James had so carefully gathered became a blueprint for destruction. "He's in the bell tower," one of Blackwood's men shouted, opening fire. But lightning revealed the tower empty. The next shot came from ground level, then the hotel roof, then what seemed like thin air. Ghost Eye had become truly ghost-like, appearing and vanishing between thunderclaps. Sarah's mirror signals flashed like lightning strikes, guided by instinct rather than geometry. Tommy Miller's oil-soaked sawdust ignited in brilliant patterns, turning mathematics into art. Each defender moved, like they'd practiced but not with precision, with the fluid grace of hunters. "Find him!" Blackwood commanded, his voice nearly lost in the storm. "Use Mitchell's measurements!" But the measurements had become a trap. Every position James had marked as safe became deadly. Every angle he'd calculated proved false. The geometry of Cedar Ridge twisted like a living thing, buildings seeming to shift in the rain and darkness. Thomas moved through his town like a vengeful spirit, the Whitworth singing its deadly song. No more carefully measured kill shots. Instead, he picked apart the very structure of Cedar Ridge, using James's detailed measurements to systematically destroy every piece of cover. A shot rang out from the general store. James trying to predict his old friend's position through pure calculation. The bullet whined harmlessly as Thomas rolled through a door that, according to James's measurements, should have been blocked. "Pattern's broken!" James shouted in frustration. "He's not following any mathematical logic." "Because this isn't about mathematics anymore," Thomas called back, his voice seeming to come from everywhere at once. "This is about the geometry of fear." The Whitworth spoke again. The general store's front window exploded, not from the bullet, but from the support beam Thomas had shot 3 minutes earlier, finally giving way. James's own measurements, his own careful calculations, had become the blueprint for his positions. Destruction. Lightning revealed the chaos, if only for a moment. Blackwood's men, their precise formations shattered, firing wildly at shadows, buildings that seemed solid one moment becoming death traps the next, and through it all, Ghost Eye's signature, not in the clean shots of a mathematical killer, but in the controlled demolition of everything James had measured. "Fall back," Blackwood ordered, finally understanding. "He's not trying to kill us. He's destroying the town itself." "No." Thomas's voice came with the thunder. "I'm destroying your certainty, your mathematics, your belief that anything can be calculated and controlled." The storm reached its peak as Cedar Ridge's defenders moved like wraiths through their own streets, each one part of Thomas's new equations, not of trajectory and distance, but of chaos and fear. Every shot, every movement, every flash of mirror and flame created a tapestry of controlled destruction. In the rain and darkness, Ghost Eye had truly become a ghost, haunting his own town with a precision that had nothing to do with mathematics and everything to do with terror. The storm raged at its peak as Cedar Ridge burned, not with random destruction, but with calculated chaos. Every fire Tommy had set, every support beam Thomas had shot, came together in a masterpiece of controlled demolition. The very measurements James had gathered to trap Ghost Eye now sealed his own men's fate. "The store's coming down," Sarah's warning cut through the thunder. The general store's foundation, weakened by precise shots Thomas had placed minutes earlier, began to crack. James Mitchell barely escaped as his carefully measured fortress collapsed. "Fall back to the church," Blackwood ordered, but even that refuge had become a trap. Thomas's shots had transformed the building's architecture into a maze of shifting shadows and false shelter. "You can't hide behind mathematics anymore." Thomas's voice carried through the chaos. "No more calculations, no more precision, just the hunt." Lightning revealed James and Blackwood together, backed against the church wall. The uncle and nephew, their careful plans shattered, now faced the legend they'd helped create. 20 years, James called out into the storm. 20 years I helped you measure every angle, every distance, taught you precision. "And I learned," Thomas answered, materializing from the shadows like his namesake. "Learned that some things can't be measured, like betrayal, like revenge." Blackwood raised his rifle, attempting to calculate the shot, but Thomas was already gone. The Whitworth's crack came from an impossible angle, sending the weapon spinning away with surgical precision. "That shot was mathematics," Thomas's voice echoed. "For old time's sake, but this—" The Colt revolver roared far closer than they'd expected, forcing both men to dive for cover. "This is instinct." Sarah's mirror flashed from somewhere high, catching James in its reflection. For a moment, father and daughter's eyes met across the battlefield. Then Tommy's signal flares erupted, turning the rain into curtains of light. "And shadow, you taught him too well, James," Blackwood snarled. "Turned him into something even mathematics can't predict." "He was always something more," James admitted, his voice heavy with realization. "I just couldn't see it through my own calculations." The storm's fury matched the chaos below as Thomas's defenders moved like extensions of his will. Every position James had mapped became a death trap. Every measurement he'd taken became a weapon against his own men. In the end, it came down to 3 men in the rain. Thomas emerged from the darkness, the Whitworth slung across his back, the Colt steady in his hand. No more calculations, no more precision, just judgment. "Your son," he said to Blackwood, "and your nephew. I've carried that weight for 20 years, but you turned grief into numbers, turned revenge into mathematics, made it cold, precise, like—" "You made killing precise," Blackwood challenged. "No." Thomas's voice was thunder. "I made it honest, every shot measured because every life mattered. You turned it into equations, into geometry without soul." James Mitchell stood straighter, his one arm raising his rifle. "Then finish your calculations, Ghost Eye. Add our lives to your count." No more counting. Thomas's shot came faster than mathematics, sending James's rifle flying. No more precision. Another shot disarmed Blackwood. This is justice, raw, unfigured, real. In the rain and fire, Ghost Eye became fully human again. Not the mathematical killer, not the legend, but a man facing the cost of both precision and chaos. 20 years ago, I killed with equations, he told them. Tonight, I could have killed with vengeance. Instead, he lowered the Colt. I choose to kill the legend. Ghost Eye dies tonight with your precious mathematics. The storm began to ease as Sheriff Mills and his deputies emerged, taking the two men into custody. Around them, Cedar Ridge smoldered, not destroyed, but transformed. Like its defender, changed into something that could never again be measured or predicted. The mathematics of mercy, James said softly as the cuffs closed. The one equation I never taught you. No, Thomas replied. The one thing you taught me that couldn't be measured at all. Dawn broke over a transformed Cedar Ridge, its buildings marked by precise destruction that spoke of both mathematics and mayhem. Thomas stood in the church tower one last time, the Whitworth cradled in his arms like an old friend ready for retirement. Below, townspeople emerged to survey the damage. Every shot Thomas had fired had served a purpose. No building was destroyed, merely wounded in ways that would make them stronger when rebuilt. Even in chaos, he had maintained a certain precision. Sarah approached her father as he was led to the jail wagon. James Mitchell couldn't meet his daughter's eyes, but his words carried clearly in the morning air. The mathematics were perfect, he said, but I forgot to calculate the cost of betrayal. Thomas descended the tower steps, each footfall no longer measured in yards and angles. The legend of Ghost Eye had served its purpose, and now, like morning, mist, it could fade away. Sheriff Mills met him at the bottom, holding out the deputy's badge Tommy had given him. Town's going to need rebuilding, the sheriff said. Might need someone who understands both destruction and reconstruction. Thomas took the badge, feeling its weight. Not in calculations this time, but in responsibility, in redemption. A month after the battle, Thomas stood in his newly rebuilt barn, showing Tommy Miller how to clean the Whitworth. The rifle would never again be used for killing, but its precision could teach other lessons. Mathematics isn't just for calculating. And death, Thomas explained, demonstrating the proper angle for the cleaning rod. It can build as easily as destroy. The same measurements that made me Ghost Eye now help us rebuild Cedar Ridge stronger than before. Sarah visited her father in jail regularly, bringing books of poetry rather than mathematics. James Mitchell was learning slowly that some things couldn't be measured or calculated, like forgiveness. The legend of Ghost Eye grew in the telling, but not as a story of mathematical precision. Instead, they spoke of the night when calculations gave way to justice, when geometry bowed to humanity. Some said you could still see the precise angles of his shots in the rebuilt buildings, each one a reminder that precision without purpose was just empty numbers. Thomas kept the deputy's badge, but rarely wore it. His authority came not from the star, but from the way he'd transformed from a legend into a man. The mathematics that had once made him deadly now served to make his community whole. Some things, he told Tommy as they finished with the rifle, can't be calculated at all. Those are usually the things most worth measuring.